Chapter 8. Why the Paris Agreement is Failing. In December 2015, leaders from almost every country in the world approved the Paris Agreement on climate change. It was hailed as a landmark achievement, tackling climate change through national promises of carbon dioxide cuts. The agreement's preamble even spoke of limiting temperature rises to less than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or even 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. French President François Hollande said, "This is a major leap for mankind." Economist Lord Stern added, "This is a historic moment, not just for us, but for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations." Al Gore saw it as bold and historic. Unfortunately, they are wrong. The Paris Agreement will cost a fortune to carry out and do almost no good. Although its name suggests there is just one elaborately engineered agreement, in fact, the deal is made up of national commitments from individual countries that vary wildly. Each country simply declared how much carbon dioxide emissions it would reduce until the year 2030. Some countries made ambitious promises. Others made far easier to achieve vows. The Paris Agreement itself effectively staples together all those promises. Each of those promises has a cost. To achieve the promised carbon cuts, policies will have to make people and companies use less carbon dioxide emitting technologies and fuels. If these technologies and fuels were cheaper, obviously this would be cost-free, but the cuts would also happen by themselves and there would be no need for any promises. And the fact that nations are making these promises and that they are difficult to achieve means the policies will have to force people and companies to use more expensive technologies and fuels. The governments themselves rarely add up the cost of these promises, but it is possible to work out. Unfortunately, it is not as easy as just looking at energy taxes or subsidies. If a nation's policy means its citizens have to pay, say, $10 billion in extra energy taxes, then it may seem like the cost is simply $10 billion. But that $10 billion doesn't disappear. It is collected by the state and used to fund other things in the budget. Equally, when a government spends $10 billion in subsidies on solar and wind power, that doesn't mean a societal cost of $10 billion because the money is not wasted. It is redistributed, often to the rich owners of the solar panels and wind turbines. So what is the real cost? We need to identify the knock-on effects of higher energy prices for everyone. Every household, business, and organization that uses energy finds it a bit more expensive and has a little less money for other things. This slightly slows economic growth. This cost is the relevant social cost of climate policies. The reduction in welfare that comes from each nation insisting on using energy that is slightly more costly and less reliable than fossil fuels. Emissions of carbon dioxide are largely byproducts of productivity, of industry, government, and individuals producing things that we want more of, including heating, cooling, food, transport, hospital care, and so much more. Wishing this wasn't so doesn't make it go away. When countries promise to reduce their emissions, they are effectively promising to make all these things a touch more expensive. That acts as a slight brake on the economy, leading to a small reduction in growth. It does not mean that countries won't grow, it simply means they will grow slightly more slowly. We can measure the cost of this slowing growth using energy economic models. Put simply, each model can identify the likely pathway of GDP growth over coming decades, both with and without climate policy. With and without the climate policy. The difference in GDP between the two scenarios is the cost of the climate policy. Now, any model is only as good as the data and assumptions put into it. One model might be overly pessimistic. It might be based on an assumption that it is very hard to cut emissions, so strong climate policies will result in substantially smaller GDP increases, whereas another might be overly optimistic, based on an assumption that all emission cuts can be achieved at almost no cost. Unsurprisingly, climate policy partisans reliably pick the model that advances their arguments. That is why economists prefer to use multiple models, to average out the optimists and the pessimists. The most prominent nonpartisan research program that looks at the findings from a large number of energy economic models is the Energy Modeling Forum, EMF, based at Stanford University. The EMF has conducted more than 30 such studies and is considered the gold standard of energy economic modeling. Using multiple studies, mostly from the EMF, we can estimate the cost of the most expensive promises made under the Paris Agreement, those made by the United States, the European Union, China, and Mexico. Together, these commitments make up about 80% of the total promised carbon reductions. In promises made under President Obama, the United States said that by 2025, it would reduce its overall greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% compared to the emissions in 2005. Work from the EMF shows that effective policies to achieve this goal would have increasing costs over the period. In 2015, when the promise was made, obviously there would be no cost. But as the policies to achieve the promise were phased in, GDP would grow slightly slower than it otherwise would have. The increasing gap between the GDP that is and the GDP that would have been is the annual cost. By 2030, it is estimated the promised cuts would result in a GDP loss for the United States between $154 billion and $172 billion. As the U.S. GDP is now on a slightly lower growth path, this loss would continue into the future. The EU promised to cut its emissions by 2030 by 40% compared to its emissions in 1990. There is no official estimate of the cost, but the EMF finds across 7 models that reducing emissions by 40% in 2030 as a pit stop toward an 80% reduction in 2050 leads to a GDP loss of 1.6% in 2030 or $322 billion. Not every country took the same approach to making promises. China vowed to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted for each dollar produced across its economy. That's known as carbon intensity. It set a 2030 target of reducing the carbon dioxide emitted per dollar generated by its economy by at least 60% compared to 2005. This will be equivalent to reducing its overall emissions in 2030 by at least 1.9 billion tons of carbon dioxide, or 1.9 gigatons, GT in short. Here we can use the results from the Asia modeling exercise, a research project similar to the EMF but focused on the region, which ran 13 different energy economic models with and without climate policies. Its results suggest that China can reduce 1.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide for about $200 billion in annual GDP loss. Mexico has enacted the strongest climate legislation of any developing country. It has conditionally promised to reduce its emissions by 40% below what it would otherwise have emitted by 2030. Although Mexico itself has lowballed its cost estimates, independent researchers using several models predict the cost to reach 4.5% of GDP by 2030, or about $80 billion annually. This means that the total cost to the United States, the EU, China, and Mexico adds up to $739 billion, or $757 billion if the U.S. goes for the higher end of its promised range. Given that these countries are responsible for 80% of the promises in the Paris Agreement, it is reasonable to assume that the $739 billion constitutes 80% of the pact's total cost. That makes the annual global cost of the Paris Agreement by 2030 about $924 billion. Remember, all of these cost estimates assume that politicians will implement the most effective policy to achieve their nation's promised emissions reduction. Typically, one carbon dioxide tax applied across all sectors of the economy, slowly increasing over time. In real life, that never happens. Policymakers love picking winners and making special deals. For instance, back in 2008, the EU promised to cut its emissions by 20% by 2020. Stanford's Energy Modeling Forum ran a number of models for this policy and found that if done effectively, the EU would end up with a GDP in 2020 about 1% lower than otherwise. The cost of the policy would be 1% of GDP forever from 2020. Effectively, in this case, would have meant using one carbon dioxide tax that would mostly have encouraged power producers to switch from coal to less polluting natural gas. Unfortunately, politicians couldn't help but push their economies to try to increase the amount of wind and solar power utilized. They used subsidies that made the policy's cost much more expensive. In total, the researchers have found that the total EU policy will end up costing around 2.2% of GDP, more than double what the price tag could have been had the EU's politicians made more effective choices. We see the same problem in the United States, where many politicians not only want power grids to emit less carbon dioxide, but also want the reduction to be delivered by renewables, fundamentally solar and wind power. In 29 states, this is achieved through a so-called renewable portfolio standard that obligates power producers to get a specified fraction of their electricity from renewable sources. California and New York have both set 50% targets for 2030, while Hawaii aims for 100% by 2045. While this type of policy is obviously popular with solar and wind producers, research shows that it ends up costing states extra. Whereas the cheapest emission reduction, just like in Europe, will often be a switch from coal to gas, relying on renewables at least doubles the cost for states. The Paris Agreement is unlikely to be an exception to the rule that politicians do things less efficiently and less effectively than they could. The promises made by various nations will be implemented ineffectively, just like those made by the EU and the United States. Therefore, it is plausible that the Paris Agreement costs will be twice what they would be under the most effective policy possible. Thus, without hyperbole, we can say that the Paris Agreement will easily set the world back by at least $1 trillion annually by 2030, and more plausibly with less efficient policies. The cost could climb to somewhere close to $2 trillion annually. No matter which way you look at it, the Paris Agreement is by far the most expensive pact in history. At $2 trillion, it is at par with the entire expenditure on the world's military each year. Every year, the Paris Agreement will cost about 2 to 5 times the total amount of the world's previously most expensive global accord, Germany's World War I repayment, settled in the Versailles Treaty. And to put this in context, compared to some of the other policies undertaken to help the world, the annual cost of Paris is about 100 times the amount the world annually spends on protecting and promoting biodiversity. It is also about 100 times higher than the amount the world annually spends on all policies to tackle HIV/AIDS. By this point, you'll probably not be surprised to learn that there is no official estimate of what the Paris Agreement will actually achieve. To evaluate the impact on climate change of the promises made under the Paris Agreement, first we need to identify the base level of emissions today. Then we can work out what the promises of carbon cuts means in terms of effect on temperature rises. From 2020 to the end of the century, if we do nothing, the standard UN business-as-usual scenario sees the world emitting about 6,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. The total number of tons we emit is directly connected to average global temperature rises. The UN estimates that an extra 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide emitted will result in a 0.8 degree Fahrenheit increase over the long run. That means that an extra 6,000 gigatons over the century will result in a temperature rise of about 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Since we're already almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, that means that the 21st century will see the planet get roughly 7.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter if we do nothing, similar to what we saw in the MAGIC model in Chapter 2. What will happen then if nations meet their promises under Paris? The United Nations organizers of the Paris Agreement, once in 2015 and never since, released an estimate of the total maximum impact of all carbon dioxide cuts promised by all nations. It provides the absolutely best case scenario that we can hope for. This estimates a total reduction of 64 gigatons of carbon dioxide through to 2030. According to the UN's estimate of 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide, this translates to a reduction in temperature by the end of the century of about 0.05 degrees Fahrenheit. What this tells us is that even in an optimistic scenario, the Paris Agreement isn't going to come anywhere close to solving global warming. It will have a minuscule impact on the temperature by 2100. In figure 8.1, we see the feeble results of the Paris Agreement compared to what would be needed to limit temperature rises to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Figure 8.1, the size of different emission cuts. The first bar shows how much the Paris Agreement will cut by 2030. The second bar shows what the agreement will cut if promises are kept throughout the entire century. The third bar shows how much its popular claims suggest it will achieve, 50 times more than the actual Paris Agreement. For comparison, we see the cuts needed to limit temperature rises to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius, and 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius. All of these numbers have large uncertainties and should be used for comparison of relative size. The agreement promises only a tiny reduction of 64 gigatons of carbon dioxide, or a 0.05 degrees Fahrenheit temperature reduction. And this is only in a best-case scenario where every nation achieves everything that it has promised. But in reality, we are not on track to achieve even that. A 2017 landmark article in Nature puts it bluntly. All major industrialized countries are failing to meet the pledges they made to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The researchers noted that the European Union promised to cut to 40% below its 1990 level by 2030, but had enacted policies that would reduce less than half of that to 19%. Even including pledged policies, the EU will make it to less than 30% by 2030. And what progress it makes is mostly coming from a shift from coal to gas, rather than from the construction of renewable energy. The story is the same around the globe. Although it promised to cut emissions by 18% below 1990 levels by 2030, Japan is on target to cut by just 4%. Emissions in Mexico and South Korea have hardly shifted, despite their promises. And it would be entirely wrong to imagine that the United States was on track before President Trump announced plans to quit the Paris Agreement. President Obama promised in Paris to cut emissions by 18% below 1990 levels by 2025, but never backed this with sufficient legislation. Based on Obama-era policies and not taking account of Trump's reversal of them, President Obama was on track to achieve at most a 7% reduction. In contrast, the world's developing countries are on target, but only because they promised so little. For example, India pledged to reduce emissions by so little that its promises are likely to be achieved without any new climate policies at all, and it will have met its obligations even if its emissions increase by more than fourfold from 1990 to 2030. A 2018 study finds that of the 157 countries to have promised emission cuts in the Paris Agreement, only 17 have passed laws to do so. In other words, only 1 in 10 countries is taking the necessary steps to get on track to achieve what they promised. These are not the biggest countries. The nations are Algeria, Canada, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Norway, Papua New Guinea, Peru, Samoa, Singapore, and Tonga. The world will not be saved by emission cuts in North Macedonia, population 2 million, and certainly not by the most drastic actions that could be taken by Tonga, population 108,000. Every single major industrialized country is failing to live up to the promises it made under the Paris Agreement, and the few countries on track are too small to make any significant impact at all. Supporters of the Paris Agreement sometimes accept that the promises through to 2030 will achieve next to nothing, but then argue that further down the road, the pact has the potential to achieve much, much more. To justify this boosterism, they imagine that countries will change course and actually start delivering on their pledges, and that they will go even further after 2030. So, what if we give the politicians the benefit of the doubt? What if we imagine that governments break with historic precedent and honor their commitments, even though they failed to honor commitments made in past climate deals? What if we even assume that they will continue to honor the Paris Agreement pledges not just until 2030, but for the rest of the century? This is incredibly unrealistic. The two previous global climate agreements in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 and in Kyoto in 1997 came to almost nothing at the end of their deal periods, and certainly they were not prolonged for another 70 years. Nevertheless, it's worth setting out such an artificial scenario just to illustrate what we would achieve in this hypothetically best-case scenario. Extending the Paris commitments to 2100 would deliver cuts equal to 540 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Translated into an effect on temperature, it would reduce the increase in temperature rises by the end of the century by a tiny 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. To justify their support for the Paris Agreement, some backers assume not only that all of today's promises will be delivered, but that future climate conferences will lead to global pacts with ever larger carbon-cutting promises. They assume all of those promises will also be delivered, and then they attribute all of those imaginary future reductions to the Paris Agreement. The global warming policy campaigners who run the influential Climate Action Tracker website make all of these assumptions, and as a result, they conjure 50 times more reductions from the Paris Agreement than were actually promised in Paris. This approach is astonishingly misleading. It's as if I promised to skip eating a piece of cake today and told you that as a result, I would lose 25 pounds over the next year. No, that result requires my not only making a promise for one day, but also taking action over 12 entire months. Promising to take a first step is important, but it isn't the same thing as starting, and it certainly isn't the same thing as finishing the entire journey. At the Paris Climate Summit, politicians also promised to keep the global temperature from ever rising beyond 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, the so-called 2 degrees Celsius limit. Accomplishing this would mean cutting 80 times more carbon emissions than were actually promised. And remember, they are not on track to achieve even that much. To achieve the 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit target, we would literally need new and additional carbon cuts of the same size as those in the Paris Agreement every single year from 2020 to 2100, and we would need them to be actually delivered, not just promised. The politicians even went so far as to declare in their agreement that they wanted to limit the global temperature increase to below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would mean cutting 100 times more than what was promised in Paris. It is therefore accurate to say that the Paris Agreement, even if actually achieved, provides us with only 1% of what politicians are promising. Currently, we have promised to spend $1 to $2 trillion every year, and we won't be able to tell the difference in temperature even in 100 years. Indeed, it turns out that if we measure all the benefits of reduced climate damage in monetary terms, every dollar of the Paris Agreement costs will avoid just 11 cents worth of long-term climate damage. That isn't sensible. So often today we hear campaigners and politicians say the real problem is simply that promises have not gone far enough. Indeed, since the signing of the Paris Agreement, it has become more and more fashionable to suggest the entire nation should go net zero. That is, stop contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by 2050 or sooner. More than 60 countries have promised to achieve carbon neutrality within the next 30 years. The biggest emitters, China, the United States, and India, are not among them. The biggest nations that have made the pledge are the UK, France, and Germany. Finland has said it will aim for carbon neutrality by 2035. While Norway is aiming for neutrality by 2030. Australia hasn't made a net zero commitment, but 4 of its states have. Within the US, New York and California are aiming to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. All of this is far easier said than done. It is going to be very expensive, and in every case, the promise is likely to be broken. It is instructive to look at the case of New Zealand. It was actually the first country in the world to promise to go carbon neutral. It is also the first country to have spectacularly failed, and the first to promise for a second time to achieve the same thing. In 2007, Prime Minister Helen Clark declared her vision was that the small nation would become carbon neutral by 2020. She was celebrated by the United Nations as a champion of the earth. If only cutting carbon was as simple as winning attention. New Zealand not only failed to achieve the vision, but also failed even to reduce any emissions. The latest 2019 official statistics show that the country's total emissions will be higher in 2020 than they were when Ms. Clark's ambition was declared. New Zealand is on track to be a whopping 123% off Ms. Clark's vision. Yet in 2018, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern re-upped the pledge, promising to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Legislation aimed at achieving that goal was passed in 2019. New Zealand is a fascinating case study because, to its credit, Ardern's government actually asked its leading economic authority to estimate the cost of her promise. Thus, we have what is likely the only official, academically credible estimate of what it will cost to achieve carbon neutrality. This research, undertaken by the leading independent economic think tank in New Zealand, shows that just getting halfway to the target, cutting 50% of New Zealand's emissions by 2050, would cost at least $19 billion annually by 2050. For a small country with a population similar to that of the Republic of Ireland or the state of South Carolina, that's a big deal, about what the government spends now on its entire education and healthcare system. And it is only the cheapest cost of getting halfway to Ardern's target. Getting all the way will likely amount to more than $61 billion annually, or 16% of GDP by 2050. That is more than New Zealand today spends on social security, welfare, health, education, police, courts, defense, environment, and every other part of government combined. To achieve their promise, New Zealanders will need to accept an escalating carbon tax that ends up so phenomenally high that it would be equivalent to a gasoline tax of $8.33 per gallon. And even the 16% GDP cost relies on a fairy tale assumption that every single policy will be enacted as efficiently as possible. Bearing in mind the evidence that costs double in the real world, it could be 32% or more. The cost doesn't just start in 2050, which would make it easy to ignore. Getting there requires policies starting in 2020, meaning the cost will start coming in now, ramp up 16 to 32% in 2050, and stay there for the rest of the century. Across the century, the costs adds up to more than $5 trillion and could reach beyond $11 trillion. If we imagine each New Zealander paying an equal share of this amount every year across the century, the cost would be the equivalent of at least $12,800 for every single New Zealander every year. If the policies are done badly, as they have been done so far across the globe, the cost per person could even go beyond $25,000 per year. As a back-of-the-envelope exercise, if we took the percentage cost of going carbon neutral in New Zealand by 2050 and applied it to the United States, that would imply a cost of at least $5 trillion in today's money. Not just once, but every single year. That is higher than the entire current federal spending of $4.5 trillion. And again, under realistic assumptions, the amount could be closer to $10 trillion a year. But at least New Zealand will help the world in dealing with climate change, right? Even if the country will be going through a huge and protracted self-inflicted cost, it will also deliver some good? Yes, but barely. Let's get a sense of the size of the impact. If we assume that New Zealand this time will actually deliver on its net zero promise in 2050 and stick to it throughout the rest of the century, the total amount of greenhouse gas reduction will, according to the standard estimate from the UN's climate panel, deliver a temperature reduction in the year 2100 of 0.004 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 4,000th of 1 degree Fahrenheit. Given the expected temperature increase by around 2100, this means that New Zealand going net zero by 2050 will postpone the warming that we expected to see on January 1st, 2100 by about 3 weeks to January 23rd, 2100. So, New Zealand is considering spending at least $5 trillion to deliver an impact by the end of the century that will be physically unmeasurable. This will make it hard to get Kiwis to support such strong climate policies continuously for the next 80 years. Sooner or later, and likely sooner, A politician is successfully going to argue to dump the net zero promise that will deliver zilch in a century and instead double spending on things like health, education, and environment and get some tax reductions. There has never been an official estimate of the cost of the Paris Agreement, nor has there been one that gives a meaningful evaluation of its impact. Looking at the numbers, it is obvious why. The Paris Agreement will be the costliest pact ever agreed to by far. It will cost us $1 to $2 trillion per year from 2030 onward if actually fully implemented. Yet the agreement will do almost nothing for climate. All of its promises will reduce the temperature rise by the end of the century by an almost imperceptible 0.0 degrees Fahrenheit, and none of the big emitting countries are anywhere close to actually delivering on their promises. Spending trillions to achieve almost nothing is, not surprisingly, a bad idea. Every dollar spent will produce climate benefits worth just 11 cents. Surely we can do better. Right now we're pursuing a policy that won't solve climate change, not even close, and that will waste trillions of dollars along the way. Okay, I can never tell which footnotes are just citations and which are actual footnotes. There's 2 actual footnotes at the end of this chapter. One footnote says, under the Trump presidency, the United States has announced a decision to leave the Paris Agreement. However, this will only take effect in late 2020 after the presidential election, so at the time of this writing, the U.S. is still a signatory bound by its promise. And the other footnote says, since carbon dioxide is the most prominent greenhouse gas, we often just talk about carbon dioxide, but there are many other greenhouse gases like methane. To keep life simple, we are converting all of those gases according to the international standard into carbon dioxide, or what is technically called carbon dioxide equivalents.